So, hi everybody. Hello everybody from Code 19. This is Asha Jadeja with my speaker, Sid Mukherjee, who all of you know is the author of the book Gene of several other books, and somebody who has been recently in the news on his views on what's happening with COVID-19 and with with the pandemic in general. I think all of you have read his previous New Yorker article. Sid just tells me there are more coming up. Sid is also on the faculty at Columbia University and at the forefront of this research. Sid, can you please tell us a little bit about what is your current work right now, and how are you seeing? First, begin with your current work, actually, and then I can ask you the next question.
Well, I work in many fronts, Asha, and thank you for having me on the show. I'm some people might not know this, but I'm trained as a viral immunologist. My main thesis work in graduate school was in viral immunology. I have subsequently become more of a hematologist. I work on stem cells and stem cell biology, and most of our work has been in the last 4 or 5 years finding new ways to treat and cure diseases like acute leukemia and myeloma. So I'm mostly focused on cancer. Now, one of the interesting things that many people might not know is that because we're using the immune system in most cases to treat cancer, both for myeloma and for leukemia, based on discoveries made in the lab, these are very quickly adaptable to using the immune system to treat viral diseases, such as COVID-19. So we have now 2 or 3 COVID-19 projects in the lab, which use the same platforms as the ones that we have been using for cancer. So we very quickly readapted some of them. And, people always say, is this readaptation just a pro forma thing? But for us, it's not, because we actually use the understanding of the immune system to understand how a virus could interact with the immune system, just in a way, same way that cancers interact with the immune system.
So let me ask you a question there, Siddharth. Let me ask you a question there. So in your book, you had mentioned something about this OTC, how people were using a sort of a friendly virus, so to speak, like the adenovirus or something like that, to send some kind of like this genetic material into the body for OTC. Is that roughly the kind of mechanism you think that people are using right now to get something going? And on that, on that front, actually, do you think that's the kind of experiment they might have been conducting even in Wuhan? I don't want you to comment on any political aspect of it, but purely in science terms, do you think this is something that laboratories might be using and stumbling upon sort of new frontiers of knowledge on this mistakes and progress as we go forward?
Well, we can take 2 steps in this. One is to talk about drug development in general and how that proceeds. My arena is in cellular therapies, how to use cells as drugs as opposed to small molecules as drugs like aspirin or Tylenol or other small molecules. One of the things that we're doing is that we've re-engineered cells that professionally activate the immune system to express the COVID spike protein and the COVID internal proteins. Sorry, the SARS-CoV-2, I should say. Mm-hmm. That's the virus, the spike protein and the internal proteins. And we're using those to elicit immune responses. One of the big questions with COVID-19 is, what kind of immune response do you need? Do you need in general, when you have a viral infection, you need a coordinated immune response. And by coordinated, I mean both B cells, T cells, and the innate immune response, macrophages and natural killer cells and other cells, all have to act together in order to produce a coordinated immune response. So we are trying to see if we can help that coordinated immune response based on research that we've done before on these macrophage, monocyte, and other kinds of cells. This is not going to be a solution. This is not a public health solution. this is a two-pronged solution. One is to understand how to develop the most effective vaccine against COVID. So it's a research project, it's not a therapeutic project. But on the other hand, we're also doing some therapy. We're also giving these cells to patients who have active infections to see if we can incite their immune response to respond to the virus more actively than they are right now. So it's a two-pronged project.
And how is that going, in your view?
It's going very well. So we have a site identified, and we've made the cells. The cells are actually not so hard to make, and we're ready to inject the cells. Another observation or another important arena that we have worked on are a particular kind of cell called a regulatory T cell. These are cells that, unlike normal T cells, everyone knows what T cells are. T cells are part of the immune response. Unlike normal T cells, these T cells actually dampen immunity. And one of the things that we found out about the late stages of severe COVID is that a hyperactive immunity is a problem. So that's one of the reasons that many people are dying of these so-called cytokine storms, storms of immune factors that are released when you have a very severe viral infection. Now, of all the people in the world who know about cytokine storms, ironically, it's the oncologists. It's because we encountered these cytokine storms first when we started treating patients with so-called CAR T therapies, T cell therapies, cellular therapies. So ironically, our community is the expert on cytokine storms. And so we're using that knowledge to re-engineer cells to decrease the cytokine storms in the most severe patients. Now, as I said, these are not public health solutions. These are very individual solutions, but we really think that they will inform our ability to make the next generation of drugs and vaccines.
Are these trials going on only at Columbia University, Siddharth, or are these across oncologists across the world?
No, these trials are across many sites. The regulatory T cells are being run at a site at Johns Hopkins, for instance. The insertion of SARS-CoV-2 proteins into myeloid cells is being run by a company that I started called Myeloid, and that's being run at Duke in collaboration with another company called MaxCyte. So they're being run all over. And as I said, these are solutions that we think will inform the next generation of vaccines, as well as the next generation of treatments.
So speaking of companies and the the way the pandemic has opened up. I mean, I hate to say the word opportunity, but I really think this is also a very, very sort of an important time, an important portal into what the next generation of medicine is going to look like, because there's just so much uncertainty. For example, like you guys are stumbling upon the fact that the oncologists have been doing this work in this space. I think that this. As this post-pandemic world opens up and we have this whole new sort of a generation of startups that are likely to arise, what is happening here in Silicon Valley is that the venture capitalists are waking up and they are saying, oh my goodness, what would happen if we were marrying compute power, and especially quantum computing that's coming out, as we speak, basically, it's not right now. The computation in quantum computing, it's not even really for. It hasn't really become mainstream in terms of just using compute power. But I think for trials and for the biotech world, people have started thinking about it, using it, because it's got it's got such bulletproof security actually. So in terms of maintaining privacy, some of these quantum technologies are going to be, I think, pretty seriously connected with biotech and biotech research. As this happens, Siddharth, we want you to be engaged with us for the long haul, not just for the open source community, as we'll be conducting, I think, our own hackathons roughly maybe once in 3 months. And this was the first one that I'm interviewing you for. most likely we'll be having, and this one was, I would say, sort of our first trial run. I think going forward, we expect our future hackathons to be much more, having folks like you guys to be hands-on in design of the hackathon, so that we are really leveraging the online open source community. I just want to remind you that, when X Prize was launched for the X1 Wildies, if you remember, the $10 million prize from the Eric Schmidt Foundation went to a bunch of tattoo parlor guys in LA, right? Who cracked the problem of cleaning the X1 Wildies oil spill. So it wasn't, it wasn't Exxon, or it wasn't some other, university company that cracked the problem and came up with the solution. It was a bunch of tattoo parlor guys. So what we are bullish on, what we are stumbling upon right now, is that as the open source and sort of the programmer community comes on board, we expect to see lots and lots of activity on problem solving for the post-pandemic world. And we do want to keep you engaged in giving us your feedback on designing these hackathons properly from the ground up. But in terms of leveraging this open source community, what kind of problem solving do you think, Siddharth, would be do you think is amenable to this kind of crowdsourced information, crowdsourced programming and things like that, just for local problem solving?
Well, there was a nice piece today in one of the journals about using AI directed mechanisms of chest radiographs, so basically CAT scans of the chest, to predict which patients were likely to require intubation and which patients were likely to have progressed to severe disease or not. So in other words, 4 or 5 days before they developed ventilator requirements or developed severe oxygen requirements, the question was that if we feed an AI algorithm tens of thousands of scans or hundreds of scans, can the program or can the algorithm detect patients who are likely to require intubation and patients who are likely to require a higher oxygen requirements. And that was very successful. It was one of the first examples that I've seen of the use of computational technologies to predict and understand how patients are doing. I mean, at this point of time, what we really need, I think, is two kinds of solutions, and I think they're different from each other. One is what I would call low-tech science, but it's very highly impactful. And by low-tech science that's very highly impactful, I don't really mean low-tech in the sense that, these are very difficult projects, but low-tech in the sense that they don't require a lot of equipment.
Sure.
So we need to ask questions like, how can AI or computational sciences help us track patients who are infected and track their immediate contact so that we can isolate and quarantine. Quarantine is a very low-tech solution. It's not a medicine. It is really a low-tech solution. Number two is some quantitative measure of how many people are infected, how to detect them early, what signs and symptoms there might be to detect them early. And number three is how to protect patients as we open up the economy again. Mm-hmm. So what kind of masking, what kind of social distancing, what are the public policy measures, which are very wide in the absence of a vaccine, that will allow us to open the economy in the safest possible manner. Now, I call them, as I said, they're not low tech in the sense that they require a lot of thought and a lot of thinking. This is not to demean them, but to say that the solutions that are involve technologies that are not, that are cheap, that are easily available, can be mass produced, and can be easily deployed across vast populations.
Absolutely.
So these are public health.
These technologies are off the shelf, actually, also.
That's right. I remember the most famous line about technology, which is invisible technology is the most powerful technology. Mm-hmm. A pencil, as you know, is invisible technology. And it's invisible technology because it has worked now for thousands of years and you don't think about it. And yet it is still used. If you go to the most advanced scientific institutes in the country, scientists are still using this instrument that was invented God knows how many years ago, but still scribbling on paper because it works and we don't think about it.
Yes.
Uh, so those, by that I mean, these technologies are going to be extraordinarily important. A separate category is our technologies that are, I would say, require a lot of biological input, perhaps biotechnological and pharmaceutical input. So this is how to make new drugs against this virus, how to make vaccines against this virus, how to model the proteins of the virus so that we can make accurate drugs and accurate vaccines, how to, how to measure the immune response, etc. These are, I would say, very high-tech solutions.
Sure.
By high-tech solutions, I mean they're very high-demand solutions. They require a laboratory, they require collaborations with people who can grow the virus, and so forth. I think both are important, and I think the so-called hackathon community can help in both, but I would imagine that the first is the more likely arena where you will get the most, the fastest results.
Speaking of hackathons and ventilators and and oxygen, Siddharth, I see that a lot of people are coming up, like a lot of startups ideas I'm seeing now, which are kind of like a home doc. It's like having some equipment at home, something like the pulse oximeter or something like an oxygen concentrator. A lot of friends that I know in New York are so averse to the idea of going to the hospital now that they have these 3-4 items in their home, and they're connecting up. They're in fact speaking to Walmart right now to see if Walmart can provide these connected instruments, kind of like a cell phone. For let's say $500, you give all your employees of Walmart this home doctor, right, so to speak, this little set of equipment. Where do you see that aspect of healthcare going? Do you see that as a viable path where people are getting these oxygen concentrators, for example?
Well, I see it as a viable path, but it has to be integrated.
Yes.
So one of the things that I've done is over the last 4 years, I've worked with the Veterans Administration through a company, again, that I co-founded called Composite Systems, which you know about. We've worked with the VA to figure out what was the minimal equipment that is required for a COVID telemedicine visit. In other words, if you have a pulse oximeter, if you have a few questions, if you have a thermometer, and if you have a cell phone, and relatively few requirements, what is the minimal set of requirements that allows a physician to triage a person to decide whether they should come to the hospital or they can be treated at home for an infection? One of the problems is, of course, that these have to go through medical and FDA authorizations. The last thing you want to do is to give a machine or to release a machine that does not read accurately. A pulse oximeter that does not read accurately can be lethal because you might be getting the wrong number. So I would say that it's a very good thing that there are more devices that are being invented, oxygen concentrators, pulse oximeters, etc. But there's a process by which these have to be authorized for use by the FDA and medical authorities. I think this is a trend that will, in fact, this is, as you said, when you're handed lemons, you have to make lemonade.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is I don't want to trivialize this crisis. This is not a lemon. It is a giant crisis. But nonetheless, we have to understand what we can get out of this crisis. Well, one thing that we can get out of this crisis, I think that is reasonable, is a deeper understanding of how telemedicine and remote medicine will work in the future, how it can be empowered by AI, how it can be empowered by a stronger electronic medical health record, how it can be empowered by home instrumentation rather than physician visits,
Mm-hmm.
how much of this can be used to take away the agglomeration of fat and useless things that have occurred in American medicine and medicine worldwide. I mean, in places like India, you can imagine a telemedicine visit through a cell phone is extremely powerful because, you know, your doctor might be, you know, 100 miles away from where you are. If we could get good instrumentation, which is accurate, authorized, etc., then we could, of course, do this. One thing that you might know is that the FDA has, and the CDC, but the FDA has enormous power to be able to deploy this during these times of emergency. It has something called the Emergency Use Authorization, which is a document that allows the FDA to authorize a validated test or device or drug within a matter of days. What would take months can be done in a matter of days under the EUA. But it has to be used accurately, it has to be used sensibly, and it has to be used with a sense of responsibility. So just to go back to your sense, you know, there are many devices that the hackathon community can invent. I would encourage all of them to liaise with physicians early, with doctors as early as possible, to liaise with electronic health record systems and hospital systems as early as possible, and telemedicine as early as possible, and of course get them authorized by the FDA to make sure that they're not selling junk equipment.
Have you interacted with the Indian counterpart of the FDA and CDC kind of thing in India? Have you seen that? Are you familiar with that?
I'm very familiar. You know, as Kiran Shaw and I have been working on a company together to deliver T-cell therapies in India, and that company has interacted extensively with the ICMR and the so-called DCB and the Ministry of Health. But this was around cancer.
How has been your experience there? What was your experience like over there?
Extremely positive. And they have been generally welcoming of new technologies. Now, of course, India is a different problem. You know, a billion and more people, and obviously the economics are very different in India. But in general, I would say our interactions have been very positive, and there is a lot of interest in India to get solutions. On a public health level, we have to remember that in India, the likely solutions that are going to work are going to be these so-called low-tech solutions. And in fact, ironically, I think AI is a low-tech solution in the sense that it can be deployed at scale without a lot of material costs and so forth. So they've been very receptive. We just have to provide them with the solutions. And it can be as simple as I said, it can be as simple as manufacturing a mask which protects both the user and other people at a low cost, but then finding some way of enforcing the use of that mask, making it comfortable, making it cheap, and making it universal. So it may so please don't, I mean, just to be very clear, please don't construe the idea of low tech as being non-impactful. It's just the opposite, in fact.
Absolutely. No. In fact, what I'll do is after this conversation, I'm going to email you the list of our winners of the hackathon. And some of our solutions are highly impactful, but they are absolutely low, like as you said, they're using off-the-shelf technologies, which are already...
Off-the-shelf technologies are very useful. And I always remind my students and myself, this is an off-the-shelf technology. Absolutely. And it's been used for 1,000 years. And I still use it. It is one of the most valuable pieces of equipment. I sometimes ask people if they've ever been to a house without a pair of scissors.
Right.
So unless when you've been to a house without a pair of scissors, you suddenly realize how important a pair of scissors is. And it's going to be the same for this. Now, obviously, that means that we will continue work on drugs and vaccines and designing three-dimensional models of the proteins that SARS-CoV-2 expresses. We're doing all of that. But this has to be done in concert and in parallel. And right now we don't have a drug, we don't have a vaccine, we don't have antibodies. So what we have to rely on are things like isolation, contact tracing, and masking, and other such things, which I think are impactful.
I have two questions for you, Siddharth, before I let you go. The first question is about how closely are you guys working? People like, let's say in the startup that you and Kiran are doing, Kiran Majumdar, and or the startups that you're doing here on the West Coast. How closely are you guys working with the computer science people, right? I mean, are your teams deeply integrated? Do you feel that they are well integrated and they speak to each other in the common language of problem solving?
No, we do not. I have to say that we, thus far, we have not engaged deeply with folks who are working in the computer science field, partly because we speak different languages, and partly because it seems as if there's a disconnect between the fields. And if anyone can get them together more closely, no one would be happier than I am. But I've certainly worked, as I said, with electronic health records and AI quite extensively, but not in the startups that I have been involved in that are purely in the biological and in the cancer space. We just don't find the engagement that we need from the computer science world. And even though we understand biology's information, it somehow is that it still remains the case that the computer scientists and the biologists are still speaking two fundamentally different languages.
Well, we've tried to fix that, Siddharth. We've tried to fix that at Stanford by having the biotech institute that we have here at Stanford, which is self-consciously figured out that unless we marry these two fields and have them speak to each other in a really meaningful way, problem solving is going to be sort of a dream of the future. So West Coast, I know that people are thinking of the urgency of having these two fields work together, and it's going to take us many years actually of a conversation before both of them speak the similar language.
I would hope so. I mean, I hope so. And as I said, we've engaged more and more with the computational world. I'm not a computational biologist. I mean, there are people, obviously, the sequencing of genomes and protein modeling and other aspects of computer science have entered the world of biology very forcefully. It's just not what I do primarily. I'm more of an experimental or bench scientist and a translational scientist. So, but I don't doubt that this is going to be the case in the future.
When the lockdown opens up, and once, let's say, the Motwani Institute itself is launching this kind of an open dialogue thing in future, would you be open to flying down once a month and meeting people at Stanford and spending some time with our computation guys here?
I'd be delighted to. I think it might be easier to do it by Zoom than flying down once a month. But we have two companies that are working very actively in the Bay Area. So I'm there once in every 3 months anyway. So that's obviously the case.
Right. And Siddharth, the final question I wanted to ask you, give us your own sort of a guess on when do you think this lockdown is going to be lifted? When do you think we will ever get to a little bit more of a normalcy? Will we ever get back to a normal world? And if not, at least a semi-normal world, what is your guess? What's your gut feeling about that?
Well, I think that the arrival of a medicine and eventually the arrival of a vaccine will change everything. And I think a vaccine will come. There's no doubt that that this is a vaccinable disease, I think. But the vaccine will take about 12 to 14 months. So we can't be in lockdown for 12 to 14 months. I think that the lockdown will be lifted in phases. We know we have a lot of evidence that suggests that social distancing and masking and hand hygiene and quarantine and isolation are effective ways to slow down the spread of the virus, not eliminate it, but to slow it down. So the first phase, my suspicion is going to be that. the next phase is going to be either drugs or antibodies that we have invented, man-made antibodies that we invent to prevent the virus from wreaking havoc on our systems. We expect those trials, I'm involved in them, we expect those trials to start around June and have data by late June. We are in conversation with the Gates Foundation, which has been one of the leaders of this, to produce these drugs not only in the United States, but of course in India as well. Kiran and I are now in continuous conversation with the Gates Foundation to try to see if we can produce these drugs in India soon after, so that the tech transfer happens. So now we're looking at June, July, August, September. Hopefully the summer months will bring a little bit of respite. And hopefully by the winter months, we will begin to restart the isolation, quarantine, contact tracing, etc., until I would say January 2021, when we have a vaccine. And once we have a vaccine, then the whole equation changes. So that's my outlook for the next. There'll be four or five phases. It requires vigilance at every phase. So we can't let any of the phases away, but that's my outlook about what's going to happen soon.
So, Siddharth Mukherjee, thank you so much for a fabulous conversation we've had here. This is going to be so exciting for our hackathon community, first of all, to see. This is a gift for them, actually. And, one of these days we will recircle back on what are the new steps that you guys are working on, and also look forward to your article on Monday, The New Yorker.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.